Hi, welcome. Welcome to the Black Studies program, our alumni event. I'm Professor Cheryl Sterling. I'm the director of the Black Studies program. I had to change the mic a little bit. I'm considerably shorter than our speaker tonight. So we're all, of course, here to learn from our distinguished alumni, Graham Hodges, who's going to speak about the Underground Railroad in New York. But before we introduce Graham, if you'll just indulge me a little bit, I'd like to speak a moment about the program. We in Black Studies have been undergoing a comprehensive renovation and restoration of the program in the last 2 years. And we've been able to put on some amazing events. Those of you who've attended the Chuina Achebe Legacy Series last year can really attest to how we are fulfilling one of our missions, which is to bring the Harlem community and the population of the college, the student, and the faculty together. And another one of our goals, and we are really focusing on this goal this year, is to bring more students into the program and to mentor them to the fullest extent. And we've really been able to open up opportunities for them. We have several students now who are recipients of the Mellon Fellowships. They're recipients of the City College Fellowships. We've also have opened up new little minor fellowships within Black Studies to kind of recognize their academic achievements. We have students who are going abroad now to study in places like South Africa and Senegal. And we're just really constantly being amazed and made proud by their achievements. I'd like to just take this opportunity to introduce one of our students. Her name is Victoria Just, and I'd like her to come down and say a few words. Now, Victoria is the president and the founder of the City College chapter of the National Coalition of Negro Women. Now, Victoria is a student with amazing initiative, as she was the one to bring the National Coalition of Negro Women to the college. And she came to us. We didn't go running after her like we do with many students. She came to us for us to be a part of the program and to mentor, form a mentorship relationship. So here we go. I'd like you to introduce you to Victoria Just. She wants to talk a little bit about the organization.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Victoria Just. I am a double major in biology and Black Studies. And as Dr. Sterling said so kindly, I am the founding president of the National Council of Negro Women Incorporated City College section. And on the eve of our 80th anniversary, it is a momentous celebration. Our founding date is December 5th, 1935. And so this would be the first collegiate section of New York City. So I definitely would like to applaud my executive board as well as the Black Studies Department for taking on this task of helping us out with this because it is definitely a one that is hard and needs a lot of effort and commitment. And so I do thank Dr. Sterling and Jody Ann from the Black Studies Department for helping us out with this. Round of applause for them. So just briefly, the National Council of Negro Women Incorporated was founded by Mary McLeod Bethune in 1935, who had many roles, was an educator and activist, as well as serving under Eisenhower in his Black members' cabinet. And she had a vision to create an organization of organizations. So her mission was to inspire, lead, and advocate for women of African descent. And it's pretty much the goal of every local section as well as collegiate section. We have over 140,000 members. And so with the legacy in mind that she left, we want to carry that through every section that we have. By bringing this collegiate section to City College, we hope to complete that mission, but as well as open it to everyone else who's willing to be a member. And so we are a very diverse organization, and so we open up to everyone who is willing to be a part of it. We are trying to create initiatives that will get members to see what we're really about in terms of meeting the needs of the community, as well as meeting the needs of our members. And so that not only includes academic, but also physically, spiritually, and mentally. So having events that will cater to the mental needs of the student body, the spiritual needs of the student body, as well as any issues that are pertaining to women of African descent. We also have men who are involved, and they are called advocates. And so any initiatives that they would like to lead pertaining to issues of Black men within the community, that is also encouraged. And so for right now, we've started our orientation as of last week to get members on board. We had an event which we collaborated with Ndugun and Zinga on this yesterday. And on Wednesday, we will have our Smart Goals Vision Board Party. Smart Goals Vision Board Parties addresses people coming together and creating a vision for themselves, right? So what do you envision for yourself for next semester, for the next 2 years, and utilizing SMART goals to do that. And so if anyone would like to attend, it is tomorrow at 7 p.m. in NAC 1211. We are also hosting a campaign that is called 16 Days of Activism Against Gender Violence, in which we'll have a series of events that focuses on not only international awareness of gender violence, but also domestic. And so we will collaborate with the Black Studies Department in letting everyone know about those future events. And we look to planning many more for next semester and the next upcoming years. We hope to get chartered by the national organization by this summer, so please be on the lookout for that. If you have any questions, I believe we'll be in contact with Dr. Sterling about getting the message out to you. You can also email us at ncnw@gtest.ccny.cuny.edu. Again, that is ncnw@gtest.ccny. That's too much? We'll again, ncnw. @gtest.ccny.cuny.edu. Is everyone all hearts and minds clear? Yes? Okay. Thank you. And if anyone would like to participate or be more involved, I will definitely be in the back at the end of the talk as well. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I've been teasing my colleagues that I've been creating a diva squad of amazing, intelligent young women that I'm going to deploy around the country, over the next few years. And we could see that with students like Victoria that I'm not lying. It's really, what I plan to do. Now, on to our main event. It's my pleasure to welcome Graham Hodges back to City College. Graham is the George Dorland Langdon Jr. Professor of History and Africana and Latin American Studies at Colgate University. His publications are so numerous that I will only name a few. Taxi, A Social History of the New York Cabdriver, Anna Mae Wong, From Laundryman's Daughter to Hollywood Legend, Root and Branch, African Americans in New York and East Jersey, Slavery, Freedom, and Culture, Slavery and Freedom in the Rural North, The Black Loyalist Directory, Black Itinerants of the Gospel, The New York City Cartmen, 1650 to 1860. This is only a few, okay? All right? He is a distinguished Fulbright Professor of History, and of course, he began his amazing academic career as a graduate of Black Studies in 1973. So I would like to just welcome Graham and give him the podium. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back at City. Let me indulge in a brief anecdote about how I got to this place. Back in the early 70s, I began college upstate and had a rather checkered career there. Vietnam turmoil, personal confusion, wound up down in New York, working first as a janitor at St. Luke's Hospital, and then driving a cab, and I thought I might like to go back to college. So at one point, I found myself in the back of the old admissions building down 137th Convent, okay, talking to an older lady, a stout lady, who was chain smoking filter cigarettes, and her lipstick was quite far up the cigarette. I showed her my rather mediocre transcript, and she ignored my failings and looked at the part that said Regents Diploma, which meant something in those days. And I looked at her and I said, I'd like to go to school here. And she looked back at the diploma and she looked at me and she said, okay. And so it was that I was admitted to City College, and it really did an enormous amount for me. I found myself in great classes with fabulous students all talking at once. It was a City College discussion, was 8 people sitting around a table in the old cafeteria all talking at once. Wonderful professors who taught me a great deal about black history, about black literary figures. I remember the first classes I had was about Richard Wright and Chester Himes, and it was people I've thought about and written about to the present day. So I graduated from CCNY in '73, took an MA here before I went down to NYU and got my PhD. So this place has a great deal of meaning to me, and I'm very pleased to be back here. Okay. What I'd like to do tonight is give you a kind of a two-part discussion. First will be an argument about material that I am very interested in, and then, if I can find my glasses, the second part will be a slideshow about my more recent book on David Ruggles, whom some of you may not know, but was the person who rescued another drifting person coming to New York City without a home, penniless. I'm speaking about Frederick Douglass. Okay? And so this is the man who ultimately saves him. So there'll be two parts. The first part is an argument. When I was upstairs having some of that delicious food, someone said they didn't really know a good definition of the Underground Railroad, and I responded there really isn't. Okay? Despite the fact that we've been talking about the Underground Railroad for over a century, certainly since the publication of Wilbur Siebert's book in 1898. Okay? And a lot more recently, there's a lot of new stuff coming out on the Underground Railroad. We don't really have a good definition, but let me try this. That is the enabling of self-emancipated people in their striving for freedom, helping also to fight against kidnappers coming to the North to seize the free and put them in slavery, and even through the antebellum period, which is when most people think about the Underground Railroad, to fight the slave trade, which was very active in New York port. Okay? So what I'd like to do, because we talk a lot about the Underground Railroad in the antebellum period, roughly in the 1830s, and there are people who argue that that's really when it starts. Okay? But I'd like to push it back a little bit further and start off with a little notation about a guy named Colonel Tighe. And this, to begin, the messages came early and often in the battle for empire in British North America. In November 1775, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, proclaimed freedom to all indentured servants and enslaved people willing to help His Majesty suppress the current horrid rebellion. In short, to give up, to sacrifice, to fight for the English to gain freedom. Okay? Coincidentally, this happened in November of 1775, or perhaps responding to the rapid streams of communication we now understand occurred between enslaved people in the North and the South. Titus Corley's, about 21 years of age, about 6 feet high, left his master, John Corley's of Shrewsbury, Monmouth County in New Jersey, bound for Virginia. And he returned a couple of years later, now known as Colonel Tighe, leading a motley crew of black and white guerrilla warriors who raided patriot homes, took captives, took livestock, foraged, food, and silver. He was so successful that Governor William Livingston, the famous Livingston family of New York and New Jersey, was forced to declare martial law in the county. Okay? Before his death in 1780 from a gunshot wound, Tighe terrorized the Patriots on many occasions and took prominent local militiamen captive for the English. Now, he was not the only enslaved black to act upon British calls for service. Certainly there were many thousands in the South, but even in the North. British General Sir Henry Clinton issued the famous Phillipsburg Proclamation in 1779 that repeated Dunmore's call that those blacks who would come to fight for His Majesty would receive freedom. Okay? And this affirmed a concept enunciated in the famous Somerset decision of 1774 and made New York City, by now occupied by the English, as it would be throughout the war, a free soil territory, a place where slavery did not exist. Okay? They arrived in New York from all over the Atlantic coast, over 200 from Virginia alone, escaping from such noted slave owners as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. over 135 free and 535 self-emancipated blacks came from New York and New Jersey to fight as black loyalists. Now, there's now a pretty substantial literature on the black loyalists. There's some wonderful movies on them. Studies have demonstrated they were significant contributors during the Revolutionary War, as contraband people would be during the Civil War and the battle against slavery. And once the war was over, the English honored their commitment, a commitment of honor, to offer freedom during that war, and those black loyalists circumnavigated the globe. They made a return diaspora to Sierra Leone to found that nation. And some became lifetime soldiers for the empire and fought for the crown in the Caribbean, in India, and even so far away as Australia. These people, as Maya Jasanoff has termed them in her recent book, were part of the memorialization of the spirit of 1783, as opposed to our more famous spirit of 1776. These were freedom seekers in the age of revolution, who opted for democracy within a constitutional monarchy, rather than a republic where they would be enslaved. So freedom with the English, slavery with the Americans here in New York City. And I want to push Jasanoff's insight a little bit further to link the Loyalist place in the age of revolution in the grand battle against slavery culminating in our own Civil War between 1861 and 1865. I'm helped in part because of a lot of recent discussions about the gaining of freedom, most notably Ira Berlin's recent book, in which he says that freedom is only gained through armed struggle. The black loyalists, along with other black freedom fighters of the American wars, joined their individual dreams with national liberty. They had the same kind of Republican consciousness as did their white counterparts. They simply fought on the losing side. Certainly, the black abolitionists later on would make other Americans recognize that overall value and would communicate from America with loyalists, black loyalists in Africa. During the Revolution, black freedom makers massed in Loyalist New York City, along with Charleston and Savannah. And this was the home for over 3,000 blacks, many of whom eventually went to Nova Scotia and then on to Sierra Leone. And just as Confederate armies later executed and imprisoned blacks viewed as Union supporters, so those black loyalists were open to arrest and execution by the Patriots. What I'd like to do is to link those black loyalists who come in to New York at the beckoning of an empire, offering freedom to them, with one of the most popular of American topics, the Underground Railroad. A quick Google search of the railroad fetches over 3.1 million hits. So this is something Americans truly honor and believe in. And this is something which extends from Canada to the United States down to Mexico. And there are many, many sites for the Underground Railroad, famed conductors. There are related sites for movies, over 2,500 books, many of them aimed at the children's market. This is something, of course, Harriet Tubman being the most famous of these, but almost all of the Underground Railroad operatives have somehow received attention for books aimed at young children. But at the same time, that coverage remains incomplete. There's been a lot of good books recently by Eric Foner, by Richard Blackett, myself, which are solid regional studies. There's also a growing literature on the ties between abolitionism and the Underground Railroad. And one of the most important suggestions, I think, is Eric Foner's observation that one cannot think of fugitive slaves without thinking of the Underground Railroad. And I think this is really significant because it didn't happen before. Somehow there was a gap in our understanding between the acts of self-emancipation and those enablers of the Underground Railroad. And also we get a now sense of the long emancipation between the American Revolution and our Civil War. And I argue that discussing the Underground Railroad from the colonial period through the Revolution into the early national period, we can broaden our understanding of what Vincent Harding, long time ago, if you know the name Vincent Harding, talked about as the river of resistance by which enslaved people in America fought against bondage with their lives and gained freedom whenever they could. And I want to expand upon a definition which I think really is limited by a technological innovation, the railroad. Okay? To push that to an earlier geography, the Underground Railroad, along the Appalachian Mountains, or southward into Florida, where the Seminoles welcomed black self-emancipated people from South Carolina, okay? Or on the ocean. Okay? Freedom seekers also had maroon settlements. We know a lot more about people living in the Dismal Swamp in what is presently known as Indiana, okay? Or in the free black communities which dot the coastal cities after the Revolution. Okay? And bringing all of those early national and wartime escapes enlarges the number of self-emancipated people. This has always been one of the big arguments about the Underground Railroad, is that it didn't really cripple slavery, that the numbers were so small that they could not really be measured adequately. But even Cassandra Pybus, who is one of the more conservative enumerators of the black loyalists, agrees at least 15,000 people left with the English. Okay? Match that with the 1,000 or more who leave during the national period, the 5,000 who leave with the British during the War of 1812, and then ongoing every year, 2,000, 10,000 leaving during the late antebellum period, and then with the contrabands or self-emancipated people of the Civil War. And you see a wave, a river of people who really do challenge slavery with their numbers. And many of them, of course, later on come back to fight during the Civil War, as they did during the American Revolution. Okay? And I think we need to really redefine the term to bring in support for the fugitive slaves. Okay? And then to really see this as something that goes on from the colonial period through the Revolution all the way up to the Civil War. Okay? Sometimes people think that the goals and methods of the Underground Railroad were obscure. Now, the man I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, David Ruggles, provided an interesting philosophy, and you're going to see this quote in a few minutes, but let me just introduce it now. Okay? That the Committee of Vigilance, which existed in Lower Manhattan from 1835 until 1860, Ruggles is one of the founders with it, in a multiracial group of men. Okay? Later on, the saintly Isaac Hopper leads it, okay? And then finally Sidney Howard Gay, as Foner has illustrated in his new book on the Underground Railroad. Ruggles argues that to effect a mighty revolution, such as the general abolition of slavery, requires agents and funds and time and influence. And while we long and labor for the accomplishment of this noble cause, let us not lose sight of the minor evils. And here he was talking about kidnapping. Okay? He was talking about slave trade in New York, okay? Which in the aggregate make up that monstrous system of iniquity. Speaking this in 1835. Let us in every case of oppression and wrong inflicted on our brethren prove our sincerity by alleviating their sufferings, affording them protection, giving them counsel. He was close friends with a number of white lawyers who help out the self-emancipated. And then in our own individual spheres of action, prove ourselves, and I think this is a good way to think about the Underground Railroad, as practical abolitionists. People who are working on the ground. This is the exact term that he uses in 1835. And I think it's a term which is applicable for the colonial all the way through the Civil War period. And this meant to him stopping kidnappers in the streets. Okay, this meant enabling the self-emancipated, such as Frederick Douglass, and halting any resurfacing of the Atlantic slave trade. And he anticipated that rising tides of levels of violence in slave rescue cases. Stanley Harold has recently shown in his book, Border Wars, just how commonly it was for pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to use violence in the struggle over the self-emancipated. Okay? There was certainly a great deal of this in the western regions of the United States, especially in Texas, where Mexico, bordering it, had abolished slavery in 1829. And over 3,000 self-emancipated people lived just over the border. Okay? As many scholars have demonstrated, fugitive slaves became a significant part of the national debate. If you look at Richard Blackett's recent book on that. Okay? But this happens much earlier. Okay? We see it with Ruggles. We see it with the great flow of people into the English armies during the Revolution. Okay? We see it in the newspapers, self-advertisements to help out people. Okay? Certainly the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 helps ramp up violent confrontation, but the same kind of things happened in New York City in 1788, in 1798 that we know about, in which blacks surrounded kidnappers seeking to return the self-emancipated into slavery and defeating them and whisking them away to freedom in the North, more and more up to Canada. Okay? And this is something that was well known by blacks in the post-Civil War period, when the first book was written by a former Underground Railroad operative named Reverend William Mitchell, working out of Toronto, using the very term Underground Railroad. But I think all of those books, whether it's Borderwick's recent book, Bound for Canaan, Siebert's famous book on the Underground Railroad, some of the others, leave that big question unanswered. Given that enslaved people fled from bondage from the early 1600s on, in New York City, for example, there were hues and cries in which sheriffs would announce the departure of a self-emancipated person for Indian territory, okay, or off to sea, or perhaps into New England. Okay, that we should not, again, as I said, leave this to a technological innovation, but rather we should talk about resistance as it happened long before that, okay, in which the Underground Railroad has a great deal of meaning. Okay. One of the ways I think which is most interesting is that with the arrival of black churches in the post-revolutionary period, those churches up and down the North became conduits for the self-emancipated. Okay. This has been demonstrated in Cheryl LaRoche's recent book about Indiana, Emma Trustee's book about southern New Jersey, and certainly in any work on William Still earlier on. Okay. These contentions, while certainly somewhat speculative, argue for a powerful communion of the religious thrust of the black community with the desire for freedom. Okay? And the narratives of self-emancipation among former slaves, William Still's famous compilation, and the black mobs of earlier time indicate that there was this constant flow of self-emancipated people throughout all of this time, and we should rename the Underground Railroad to give it something broader. Okay? And these are all characterized by interracial cooperation and by a mixture of legal slight, pacifism, and occasional violence. Okay? And this makes it the Underground Railroad a powerful, unacknowledged force in American history. Now, I've talked already about the Revolutionary period and also about the early National period. I'd like to shift ahead a little bit to talk about this man. How many people have heard of this man before? A couple of you. Okay. This is a great New Yorker. Okay. He originally is from Norwich. He's the subject of one of my most recent books. Okay. And he was a radical black abolitionist. He firmly believed that slavery should be ended now. Okay. That it should be, he's very much of an immediatist. He comes from Norwich, Connecticut. And the small area at the top of the triangle, is from a plot of land in Bean Hill, a suburb of Norwich, where the governor, the first president of the Continental Congress lived, and where Ruggles was the eldest son of 7 to a woodcutter and a caterer who lived in a tiny house. I've been to that plot of land. It's not a whole lot bigger than that piano headed back to the wall. It's really quite tiny. He grew up there and lived nearby, was a coachman for this man, who was the president of the First Continental Congress in 1775. This is Samuel Huntington. Okay? And Ruggles is taught by this woman, Lydia Huntley Sigourney, in a charity school, which is a common thing for free blacks in the North to go to these kind of schools. He was so good that eventually they brought in a tutor from Yale to teach him Latin. Okay? Now, this is a very interesting excerpt that I found after the book came out, and I think this got some additional insights into Ruggles, and if you will, to his most famous protege, Frederick Douglass. Okay, and this is a racist book article. It was published in 1876 by one of his neighbors, okay, and talks about Nancy Ruggles' eldest son, Dave, who was the smartest black we were ever acquainted with. Talks about some of the jobs: houseboy, waiter, coachman, errand boy, okay, and that he was a friend of a man named Caesar Reynolds, a large, vicious-looking bully, with whom he engaged first in pranks like stealing watermelons, but then graduated to more serious crimes of horse stealing, and only through the intercession of his mother's connections with the well-born in Bean Hill was Ruggles kept in one of those near misses that young black men often experience. Okay? With the law, Caesar Reynolds goes off to state prison and is hanged when he gets into a murderous conflict with one of the keepers. But Ruggles studies at the local district school, reads in the highest classes, and as you can see, is proficient in arithmetic, geography, grammar, and even studied Latin using a tutor from Yale College. He also was, and I think this is kind of interesting, was the acknowledged leader of boys in all sports, okay? And even went so far to annoy the local constable, and another incident not mentioned here, got into a confrontation with his teacher. Clearly, Ruggles is too hot to live in Norwich, so he becomes first a mariner, working on coastal vessels up and down New England, and then eventually moves to New York, near the 5 Points, downtown, where he opens a grocery, selling alcohol, okay, and takes part in the merriment along 5 Points. You know about this area at all. It was where, as Walt Whitman said, musicians, dancers, drinkers, prostitutes created song and music that presaged a grand American opera. Okay? It's some of the most wonderful areas for music, but it's also an area of drinking and destitution. We know that Ruggles is there because there's a book at the American Antiquarian Society called Bacchanalia, about the kind of fun that one can have in places like this, and it's got Ruggles' autograph in it. Okay? But he sobers up. First of all, he meets this man, the Presbyterian minister, free black Samuel Eli Cornish, who is the publisher of Freedom's Journal. Okay? And Cornish convinces Ruggles to combine anti-slavery with temperance. And this is announced in Freedom Journal that David Ruggles will no longer sell alcohol at his grocery, okay, and moves more and more into the circuit of anti-slavery. Okay, so Cornish is very important. They later have a big falling out, but he's a major influence on him. Okay, similar influence, as Berlin has argued very recently, of course, David Walker's famous appeal, okay, which tells slaves if they want to be in this country, they must battle against slavery and kill or be killed. A statement then taken very seriously by Nat Turner in Virginia 2 years later. Okay, these are the young Ruggles. He's only at this point about 20 years old. Okay, very impressionable. This kind of message rings very, very strongly with him. Okay, he also encounters this man, William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, the editor of The Liberator, the founder of New England Anti-Slavery Society. Okay, a man who believes in moral suasion. You must convince slave masters to give up their chattel. It didn't really work, but if you think about it, moral suasion really means giving up racism. Okay? And if Garrisonianism had been followed by a lot of people, well, we'd have a much better country today. Okay? Ruggles becomes an agent for Garrison, trying to sell The Liberator to townspeople in western Pennsylvania, upstate New York. Okay? He engages then in anti-slavery politics at the most local level. Okay? As an agent, of course, trying to get subscriptions. He also encounters and works for this man, Lewis Tappan, the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society in New York City, an editor of the Emancipator. So Ruggles is actually working in the newspaper business as an agent for the two most important abolitionist newspapers of the day. Okay? And he begins to write. Okay? He has other colleagues like this Charles B. Ray, a congregational minister, Samuel Ringgold Ward, who works for Ruggles in his grocery shop. Later becomes a very important congregational minister, even in Cortland, New York, which is up near Colgate where I teach. And Henry Highland Garnett. These are the young Turks, if you will, of the movement in the 1830s who don't want to follow the more cautious, careful arguments of earlier people like Peter Williams Sr., okay, but rather, Jr. rather, who want emancipation right now. Okay? Now, in 1834, anti-black rioters destroy much of the black community in Lower Manhattan. And they burned down St. Philip's Church. They burned down the home of Arthur Tappan, who's the brother of Lewis. Okay? They attacked blacks in the street. Okay? And this man, Peter Williams Jr., who was an Episcopalian cleric, is ordered by his racist supervisor to abandon anti-slavery work. Williams agrees, at least in principle, but continues to work sort of underground to help people out, to give them recommendations, to enable the contact between people like Ruggles and the wealthier. Okay? Many people feel that Williams was cowed by the riots. I don't think that's really true, but certainly it's not the case with Ruggles, who shortly after that opens an anti-slavery bookstore down on Lisbernard Street. He lives in several places down Lisbernard Street, and begins publishing. This is his first effort. The extinguisher extinguished by, or David M. Reese, MD, used up. David M. Reese is not well known today, but at the time, he was the chief physician of Bellevue or New York Hospital. Okay? He was a leading colonizationist. The argument that free blacks should leave America and go to Africa, perhaps to spread Christianity, but at least, as Thomas Jefferson so famously put it, we must get rid of them. Okay? Ruggles contests this and has an argument in print, and if you note down here, it's published and sold by D. Ruggles Bookseller on Lisbernard Street, which is just below Canal Street. Okay? This is one of the first black imprints in our country. It's not the first, but it's one of the first. And he follows it. There's a similar one from 1838 in which he follows this up. So he's into confrontational politics, okay, and battling against some of the most eminent whites of his day. Okay? He also appeals to women, black and white. Okay? And the abrogation of the seventh commandment, which depending on your faith means either you will not covet a neighbor's property or you will not covet your neighbor's wife. He argued that Southern whites who frequently came up to New York City to shop, to seek medical treatment, to get away from the heat of the southern states, okay, or to look for their fugitive slaves, they, along with their wives, who tolerated the rape of black women by their husbands, their sons, their brothers, and other relatives, that they should be shunned. He asked white women and black women to follow this practice. People didn't listen to him, but it was part of his overall message to women to bring them into the discussion of anti-slavery politics in a very radical way. Okay? But his most famous efforts, perhaps, were to fight kidnappers and to enable fugitive slaves. This is an illustration of a kidnapper taken from a book from 1818. Okay? And kidnappers were, I think this has something to do with Ruggles' overall effort in the streets, in the black community of New York City. Kidnappers would come up in the years after New York ended slavery in 1827, and working on the agency of a master from the South, grab anyone black who seemed to fit the description of a runaway. Okay? They would then take him before a corrupt judge named Richard Riker, for whom the island is named, okay? And he would willingly condemn this person, whether or not identification was well done or not, okay, into bondage, and then they would be taken off into slavery. If you saw the incredible movie 12 Years a Slave, you got a sense of just how these kidnappers worked. And it's a brilliant, brilliant movie, and it really does evoke this. This is the kind of thing that so deeply affects the black community. Because after all, the children, the husbands, the wives of black New Yorkers were all susceptible to the ensnarement of these kidnappers. So Ruggles, along with several others, starts the Committee of Vigilance. And this really is, I think, one of the first stated arguments of the Underground Railroad. And this is a publication which is literally the report of the railroad, of the Committee of Vigilance in 1837. Okay, and you can see that he mails this up to Beriah Green of the United Institute, which is the first interracial school in America. Okay, okay, and this is the quote I gave you earlier. This is really his philosophy. Okay, that this is what you have to do to fight those minor iniquities, to fight against kidnapping, against the slave trade, and prove themselves practical abolitionists. Okay, and what this meant was, again, stopping kidnapping, protecting the self-emancipated, and stopping the illegal business of slave traders coming to New York. Okay, more prominently, in a famous speech made at Asbury Methodist Church, which is down at that point on Houston Street, he argued we cannot recommend non-resistance to persons who are denied the protection of equitable law when their liberty is invaded and their lives endangered by avaricious kidnappers. Anyone, when pounced upon by a kidnapper, must not only use words implying resistance, but should resist even unto death. Okay. This at a moment when the abolitionist movement believed so firmly in moral suasion, they had to talk about this. That pacifism was, which is a very important reform movement during this time, that pacifism was the way to do it. Ruggles said, no, this doesn't make sense. If you're somebody, your family member, or you being attacked, you must resist. Nothing else is practical. Okay? And in this Mirror of Liberty, which is the first black newspaper published in America, printed downtown by David Ruggles at the corner of Church and Lispenard Street. And if you go down there today, the building where he lived still stands. There's a plaque outside because it's where his most famous visitor came north. This is sort of the second annual report of the Committee of Vigilance. He publishes 5 issues of this. Okay? And they're very interesting, not only for the anti-slavery appeals, but also for the poetry that he writes dedicated to women. Okay? To the subscribers list, in which he enumerates the people who later could be counted on to house the self-emancipated. Okay? And also just for the open discussion of what he was doing. This was at a time when Broadway was the main street of America. Broadway, Broadway, Broadway. Have you seen Broadway, sir? Announced the New Yorkers to visitors from everywhere. Okay? It was our most proud street in Lower Manhattan. Okay? And there's Ruggles living right off it, operating this anti-slavery bookstore, welcoming self-emancipated people into his home. Okay? He also would fight against the slave. This is a fascinating document. This is from the New York City Archives. And this is a deposition that David Ruggles makes against a Captain Wilson. What happened in this case was that Ruggles, Isaac Hopper, a Quaker anti-slavery person whose career goes from the 1780s all the way up to 1850, okay, and Barney Corse, who was a member of a famous Episcopalian family, go to this Wilson's hotel room and accuse him of slave trading. When they go, they sit in a chair, and Wilson orders Ruggles to stand because it's an insult to have a black man sitting in front of him. Ruggles refuses. In the ensuing struggle, Wilson kicks Ruggles down the stairs. Okay? And Ruggles goes out and finds a policeman and has Wilson arrested. So it's a black man having this white captain arrested. And here you can see his autograph. Now, here's his signature. And I found out about the American Society of Graphologists, handwriting people. Okay? And it's not a normal thing for an historian to do, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting to send it off to them and see what they had to say about his autograph. Okay? And they ran it through their various tests, which included a number of computer examinations that I didn't understand, okay? And came back and said that his handwriting was reminiscent of an educated person taught towards the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, which is certainly about Ruggles, okay? That it was somebody who was very aggressive, very intelligent, which I think is also Ruggles, okay? Someone who had physical maladies, and Ruggles' struggles already had cost him problems with his bowels. He was nearly going blind. And finally, they said that he had a lot of anger against his mother. I didn't quite know what to take with that, but I mean, you know, anyway, it's possible, because Ruggles never does marry. And Richard Blackett, when he was reading my manuscript, he said, Graham, he said, don't be afraid to say that Ruggles could be a pain in the behind, because he was all about the movement. He really is our first full-time anti-slavery activist. There's nothing but the movement for David Ruggles. Okay? But then on September 3rd, late at night, a fugitive got off the train in New York City, went down to the docks, hid among the barrels, broke, lonely, afraid, told by a black man he'd known from Maryland named Allender's Jake that he should get out of town as fast as possible. There were kidnappers everywhere. Okay? That was this man. He is taken then, David Ruggles comes down and finds him on the dock. He's heard he's down there, takes him to his house up on Lispenard and Church. And there, Bailey, as he was formerly known, okay, is united with his fiancée, Anna Murray, and married in Ruggles' home in a ceremony officiated by the fugitive blacksmith, James W.C. Pennington, also from Maryland, okay, where Douglas watches, because he's named Douglas after he leaves, watches Ruggles in action, and eventually leaves about 10 days later, armed with a letter of recommendation and a $5 bill, probably the greatest amount of money he'd ever earned. Okay? And the recommendation to go to New Bedford and get to know the black community there and perhaps work somewhere on the wharves, which eventually he does. So Douglas spends a lot of time with Ruggles, and what I argue with you is that, this is of course one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century, one of our greatest Americans. If you read the narrative, which of course you all should every now and then because it's one of our greatest pieces of literature, okay, you can see that Douglas names David Ruggles in the book at a time when he was still a fugitive, making Ruggles open to charges of harboring, which by the 1840s meant imprisonment or a heavy fine, which Ruggles would not be able to pay. Okay? Because he had to do this because Ruggles allowed him to do that. No one else is named, just David Ruggles. Okay? And of course, Frederick Douglass then goes on into immortality, oftentimes credited William Lloyd Garrison, the University of Abolitionism by Professor William Lloyd Garrison, okay? And of course later Abraham Lincoln. But I think it's David Ruggles who really gets him a start, because after all, Douglas is very deeply enmeshed in journalism. Okay? He becomes a full-time anti-slavery activist. Okay? He's very confrontational. Okay? Things that he learned from Ruggles, especially in this interesting case. And here we see, this is an excerpt from the first narrative. David Ruggles, whose vigilance, kindness, and perseverance I shall never forget. I am glad of my opportunity to express as far as words can the love and gratitude I bear him. Okay? And now he talks about Ruggles being afflicted with blindness. And Ruggles does eventually go blind. Okay? And he says, I had been in New York but a few days when Mr. Ruggles sought me out and kindly took me to his boarding house at the corner of Church and Lispenard Street. Okay? And very deeply engaged in the memorable Darg case. We'll talk about this in just a moment. As well as attending to a number of other fugitive slaves, devising ways and means for their successful escape. This is the Underground Railroad. This is an exact example of how it was run openly in lower Manhattan during the 1830s. And though watched and hemmed from every side, he seemed to be more than a match for his enemies. These are the immortal words of Frederick Douglass, one of our greatest Americans, in one of the greatest pieces of literature, crediting this black man who has not been sufficiently credited, I believe, for Douglass's development. Okay. Here's Isaac Hopper, whom I mentioned earlier. In the 1830s, he still wore the Quaker dress of the 1780s. Okay. And this is the Darg case. It's a very interesting case because this is what Douglass was watching as he stayed in Ruggles' home. Okay. The story on this is these three men, there's Hopper, Ruggles in the middle, and Corse. This man here is a Virginia planter named Darg, whose enslaved man, Thomas Hughes, runs away from Darg in New York City along with $10,000. Okay? And then these three men who learn about Hughes say they'll help get him back the money. Hughes spends some of it, gives some of it away, gambles other money. Okay? There's about $8,500 left, so he gets his money back. Okay? But they won't give him back Hughes. Darg accuses them of extortion. Ruggles, who has no real direct connection with the case, is arrested, thrown in jail, where he has to stand up in a dark room along with petty thieves for several days before he finally gets out. Okay? Again, these are the kind of things that Frederick Douglass was watching and seeing what was happening. Okay? Eventually, Ruggles, who was very, I would say, feckless about what he was doing, that $5 bill that he gave to Douglass was common. Okay? He didn't keep very good accounting of this. Okay? And he runs afoul of Cornish over a libel case which nearly bankrupts the Colored American, the second black newspaper in the United States. And there's a real battle between the two men. And Ruggles responds with a series of articles accusing Cornish of betraying him. And this is one of his last imprints in New York City, but he continues to put out the Mirror of Liberty. He leaves New York bereft, sickly, and goes on a tour of New England where men like this, okay, the Reverend Theodore S. Wright, or William C. Nell, or Pennington, hold soirees to raise money for Ruggles because they admire him so much. This is the younger generation of anti-slavery blacks who see in Ruggles a model for their own existence. Okay? Now, Ruggles is not finished. Eventually, he winds up invited by this wonderful person, Lydia Mariah Child, the first female editor of a newspaper in America, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, to go to live in Northampton, Massachusetts, where she has connections with the Communitarian Society, the Northampton Association for Education and Culture. They're starting a silk farm. Okay? And Ruggles goes there and works, has a house outside of Northampton where he starts a water cure business. Okay? He begins to use the water cure, corresponds with a Swiss physician about this, okay? And then you can see his home is there, okay? And helps this woman, who had come out of a scandalous situation in New York City in the 1830s, was drinking too much, had a lot of other ailments, helps her regain her strength, and she works with him for quite a while. Okay? And Ruggles eventually has this hospital at which he treats people from the South, including a slave owner at one point. Okay? Garrison comes but won't sit still for very long. But it's a successful business that he's running, at the same time welcoming people from the South on the Underground Railroad, a number of whom begin to live around his home. Okay? And this man, George W. Benson, who was from Brooklyn, Connecticut, and then later in Northampton, a tough Yankee businessman, loans Ruggles the money to start up that hospital, which is to say that Ruggles was able to convince New England businessmen that his venture was worthwhile. Okay? And even after the Northampton Association disbands, as some of those communitarian associations did, Ruggles stays on, operates his hospital with credit given by this man, which I think is really quite remarkable. And eventually, by the time of 1849, Ruggles is balancing the books. Okay? It's a profitable enterprise. Now, and this is a flyer that he puts out for his Northampton Water Cure. He publishes a whole lot of articles in the Green Mountain Spring, which is the Water Cure magazine. At the same time, continues his flow of upwards of 250 letters to the editor, editorials, if you will, appearing in the Liberator, the Emancipator, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, and others all the way across the country. So now if you go to America's Historic Newspaper put out by some of the databases, you can look up Ruggles and see he's published all the way across the country. And people know who he was. Sadly, however, he also helped support the North Star. He's one of the first people to help Douglas create this neighborhood in 1848. He's a founding subscriber and also advertises in it. Okay? But by 1849, his ailments return. And after a lengthy struggle in the fall of 1849, he dies, okay, in terrible pain. Okay? A very early death. This is the grave site of his mother, Nancy. We believe David is there someplace because we know that Nancy and one of her daughters came up and got David's body and buried. This is just outside of Norwich at Bean Hill. We believe that his remains are around there. We're not really sure. But what's certainly the case, and this is Douglas's second autobiography, Mr. Ruggles was the first officer of the Underground Railroad with whom I met after reaching the North. Indeed, the first of whom I ever heard anything. This is how important these black conductors were. And there is a river of resistance, I think, that flows from Colonel Ty, through David Ruggles, through the contraband leaders, and also Henry Highland Garnett in the Civil War. That the Underground Railroad is not something that's peripheral to American history, but directly within the pattern of resistance that black people and whites practiced from the Revolution to the Civil War. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions or, yeah.
On the fundraisers, the soirees that would be held,
Yeah.
typically, who would be the guests at these soirees?
Who would be the what?
Who would be the attendants?
Well, they would be, there was in New Bedford, in Boston, Northampton, okay, whites and blacks, okay, and primarily blacks, okay, but people who wanted to put up some money to help Ruggles during his time of need. Okay. And you can see, if you go back to the Liberator or to the Emancipator or the National Anti-Slavery Statement, you can see listings of these, and people like William C. Nell are saying, come and support our brother. Okay. Frederick Douglass holds one for him in New Bedford. In fact, just before Douglass is discovered by William Lloyd Garrison, Douglass becomes the agent for the Mayor of Liberty. So he does this as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's interracial. But I think certainly young black leaders were among the most important. Okay. Other questions? Okay.
Hi. I'm kind of curious about the relationship between Ruggles, Garrison, and Douglass, especially since Garrison and Douglass were very close at the time of the Liberator's founding. And it seems like, especially since they fell off after he started the North Star, and it seems like Mr. Ruggles was a contributor to both the Liberator and the North Star. It seemed like it would have created an interesting dynamic. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. It's a very good question. I will say that the most significant falling off between Garrison and Douglass occurs around the time of Ruggles' death. So he doesn't see that real terrible divorce that happens in the early 1850s, or the battle between, for example, William C. Nell and Douglass. I mean, Douglass didn't get along with a lot of people. Okay? But earlier on, I think what we see here is that normally we divide the anti-slavery movement into the Garrisonians and the Tappanites. Someone like Ruggles walks a very strong line between the two. Okay? He takes what's necessary from either side. Okay? While he admired moral suasion, he very much admired what Garrison did. In fact, welcomed Garrison to speak in the streets of New York City to large groups of aggrieved New Yorkers. Okay? So he welcomed him. At the same time, his argument for practical abolitionism was not something that Garrison could endorse. But Garrison, at the same time, didn't condemn him. He didn't say, this is totally wrong what you're doing. Okay? He didn't, he talked about him as a really important leader. Okay? So I think that we shouldn't make too sharp a line between these various sides. Okay? And later, Ruggles, I think convinced by Frederick Douglass, even goes so far as to become a free soil advocate and votes for Van Buren, which I'm sure in 1836 he would never have thought of doing. Okay? But later, 12 years later, when the Free Soil Party thinks it's possible that maybe they can legislate slavery out of existence, okay, and there's a lot of interesting scholarship now about how blacks and whites work together in a political way within mainstream politics. Okay, that Ruggles was able to do that. I think he was adaptable. While he's very staunchly against slavery, okay, uncompromising, I don't think he was sectarian. He wasn't saying, this is the way it has to be. I think he was willing to adapt. Okay? And I think he was open as well to other people's ideas. So the divorce between Garrison and Douglas, had he lived, he probably would have been very troubled by it. He might have even tried to reconcile, because Garrison admired Ruggles enormously. Okay? And of course, I've argued that Douglas does too. And I think he might have been a force for amelioration between the two. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Why didn't Douglas get along? Well, I mean, positions, I think. Okay? I think also perhaps sometimes jealousy. Okay? I mean, he's the chosen one. He's the major figure. Okay? Well, certainly William Wells Brown has an important biography. Also, Douglas could be a little bit prickly sometimes. He didn't like Sojourner Truth very much. He was kind of prickly. Okay, again, which is something he may have gotten from Ruggles, because Ruggles, I think, could also be rather difficult. But I mean, Frederick Douglass is not a big fan of Sojourner Truth at all. Okay, and I think that we think about these great people and what they did. In their personal lives, they weren't always amenable to others. Okay, they had their own private likes and dislikes. Certainly that was the case with Douglas during this period. And of course he is not only rubbing Garrison the wrong way, others as well. He's very very ambitious, very forthright about what he's doing, and I think Ruggles could handle him. A lot of people really couldn't. Okay, but that's not to say that he didn't stand out and they weren't very proud of him. It's just sometimes personalities got in the way, as you know happens. Okay. Other questions? I expect some rude questions here. Yes, Pamela.
It's not a rude question. You mentioned that newspaper, The Mirror
Mirror of Liberty.
of Liberty, is the first African-American newspaper?
It's the first black magazine in America, yeah.
Magazine?
Yeah.
Because Freedom Journal was...
No, this is a magazine.
Okay.
The question is about Mirror of Liberty, whether it was a magazine or a newspaper. It's a magazine. It's largely reports about battles over self-emancipated people. Okay, notice I use that term instead of fugitive slave. I think it's important here because as we know more and more about this, we want to emphasize the person who's running away, who's leaving slavery, and his or her courageous efforts. And that's really the big story. Yeah.
That was one question. The other one, in one of the slides you showed...
The mic's coming to you, Pam.
Something that was printed, it said that it was on Howard Street. The press was located on Howard
Yeah.
Street. Is that in Weeksville? Is that in Brooklyn?
That was in Lower Manhattan.
Oh, that,
Yeah, it's
another Howard
one of the
Street?
streets we've lost. Yeah, it was not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Because
not-
there's a Howard in Weeksville where where like William
Wi-
Garnett.
Willis Augustus Hodges, yes.
Right.
Maybe one of my ancestors. But at any rate, yeah, no, he does get the help of other publishers, but mostly he does it himself. And again, that building's right downtown. You can go have a very good, if expensive, cup of coffee there. Yeah. I go there at least once every time I come to New York. Okay. Other questions? All the way in the back.
No, this is just a footnote, but do you know anything about, you mentioned the black church's involvement in the Underground Railroad.
Yes.
Do you perchance know anything about Mother Zion's involvement?
No, I don't. Okay. That's not, I think what we have to do, and I'm doing this is part of a book project that I hope I'll finish the next year or two, okay, is to look at the membership of those churches and match it up with people who enable self-emancipation. Okay. I think and you can get a lot of those out of Ruggles' The Mirror of Liberty. You can get it from the black abolitionist newspapers. And again, I think you can see, the argument I'm going to have been pioneered by a woman named Emma Marie Trusty working about South Jersey. And in particular, she's identified a number of the churches where Harriet Tubman works and worships in her first couple of years out of bondage, late 1840s, working in some of those South Jersey towns and counties, which are resort communities for Quakers from Philadelphia. And also Cheryl LaRoche's book about black churches in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Okay? So I think if I come back in a couple of years, I think we probably have a better, clearer answer for you on that. Okay? All right. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I noticed you had one map in one of your slides, and I just wanted to know, did you come across in the research any other maps that indicate particular stops during Underground Railroad in the city? Repeat the question.
The question I'll give you, if I came across any maps about the Underground Railroad. The map I just showed you was really of Northampton, okay? And that's the area where Ruggles has his water cure. There's also a silk factory there. And if you look around there, are the homes of self-emancipated people who come north, most notably from the Dorsey family, which is a family of brothers, all who escaped from slavery in Maryland. But I think, you know, the general maps, of course, Siebert's maps in his book Underground Railroad, published in 1898, are pretty good. I mean, I think there's a lot to that. Wilbur Siebert. Now, a lot of people don't like Siebert because he valorizes white conductors. And there's room for argument there. I think that, that he could have, there's plenty of blacks mentioned in there as well. The book is not as bad as some people make it out to be. Okay? But he has very good maps in there. Eric Foner has a nice map in his recent book on the hidden history of the Underground Railroad about blacks coming particularly from Maryland and Virginia. Okay? We have more schematic maps than we have actual maps themselves, if that makes sense. Okay? Yeah.
You know, the other thing that Northampton brings to my mind is Du Bois. And I'm just curious if you know how close Ruggles' home was to the home of Du Bois in
Well,
Northampton.
it's about 75 miles, I think, from Northampton to Barrington, where the Du Bois family, of course, lived for several generations. They're separated by birth and death and birth by about 20 years. I think we really have to thank Douglas for keeping Ruggles' memory alive, because Douglas mentions him very prominently in all three autobiographies, 1845, 1855, and 1881. Okay? And certainly Du Bois read these things, no doubt about that. Okay? And Du Bois is certainly aware of Frederick Douglass. He doesn't enumerate Ruggles among the heroes that he lists in the second chapter of Souls of Black Folk. Why, I'm not sure. Maybe because Ruggles didn't live into the 1850s. But I think there's an important illustration there. That certainly Du Bois would have certainly approved of Douglas, certainly approved of William C. Nell, okay? And they're very similar to Ruggles. So anything direct. There certainly is. There are important. There's something about New England, and we're just now really uncovering the black history of New England. Bruce Laurie has a very nice new collection of essays just came out about Northampton black community, published at the University of Massachusetts last year. It was Laurie. Okay? Is that blacks were present in almost every town in New England. Okay? What I will recommend to you, though, is you look at my book, Friends of Liberty, which talks about Agrippa Hull, who was a free black who enlisted in the Patriot Army during the Revolution and became the aide-de-camp for to-do's Kosciuszko, the purest son of liberty Thomas Jefferson had ever met. Okay? You know the name Kosciuszko? You know where the bridge is, right? Okay, who's it named after? Not Kosciuszko, but Kosciuszko. Okay, any Polish person who will pardon my mangled pronunciation. But Kosciuszko, of course, is very important, and Kosciuszko had a black working with him from 1775 until about 1798. Okay, so, I mean, there's a significant black president, and Agrippa Hall was from Stockbridge. He worked in the same household as Mum Bet, who's very famous for her freedom suit against her former master. Okay, so these are the kind of people I think that Du Bois might have known a little more intimately. Okay, Agrippa Hull does live into the 1840s, and he's like an oral historian of the Revolution, okay, in Stockbridge. So these, it's I think quite possible that Du Bois heard about him when he was very, very young. Interesting question, though. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, since Ruggles, as you mentioned, was the first full-time anti-slavery activist, and he did a lot of things that were covert and overt, to stop the to stop the slavery movement. Why was he allowed to exist? Like, why didn't they execute him or assassinate him? Because he then went on to influence Frederick Douglass, who then takes it to a whole nother level. So.
Yeah, sure. Well, they did. When he was jailed over the Darg case, he's tossed into a dank cell and stays there for about 4 days before he's finally bailed out. He also, by the way, is very troublesome. He won't take money from just anybody. It has to be from somebody whom he fully supports. But what I argue in the book is that Ruggles was being softened up. They're trying to get him in a position where they could sneak him out of town and sell him into slavery, just as kidnapped blacks were being sold into slavery, again, like Solomon Northup was. Okay? So there were efforts to get rid of him. Okay? And eventually his health is so badly damaged, he did have, that he leaves town, he did have very powerful friends. Not just the Tappins, but Sedgwick, okay? The Jay family also were very close to him. So there were people who would, help him out in a real time of needs. I'm talking about elite white people with a fair amount of money. And he's very proud of that. Okay? There's an incident in 1845 when the Hutchinson family singers, who were the rock stars of the abolitionist movement, come to Northampton and sing. And one of them is this is a white family of singers. And they have dinner at a home with Ruggles and Douglass both present. Okay? And there's a such sarcastic argument in the newspaper that this white woman had been escorted home by a large, burly Negro. And Ruggles says, I guess they're talking about me, but I want you to know that I have had dinner with some of the most important people in New York City. Again, that prickly aspect of his personality, he wanted you to know that significant people listened to him and were his friends. So I think there's a certain degree of protection that he's afforded by those connections. At the same time, there were definitely efforts to get rid of him. And eventually he leaves town broken in, if not in spirit, certainly in body. The fact that he lasted 10 minutes perhaps is testament to his will more than anything else. Okay? But he was not immune from attacks. And I think that a lot of his physical ailments stem from the battles that he had. Now, why did he do this? Well, if you remember that slide where he and Corse and Hopper are talking to Darg, you'll see, and this is one of the arguments I make in the book, that Ruggles was very well dressed. I even think about him as being sort of a dandy, okay? A man who liked to wear fine clothes. Didn't have a lot of money, okay? But he liked it. He enjoyed good clothing. And that in itself was such an affront to the white racist working class of New York City. It would be like a flag in their face, okay, to have this man walking around town. See, he was very confrontational, okay? And only I think the associations that he had in his own personal courage kept him from being kidnapped and stolen. Sure.
Thank you for your talk. At some point, when you were doing a lead up to what you wanted to describe, Ruggles, you mentioned that 15,000 blacks left America, went to England, and at some point returned?
No. Well, that's the low estimate of black loyalists leaving America for Nova Scotia, England, and other parts of the empire. That's a calculation made by a scholar named Cassandra Pybus. If you look at Benjamin Quarles's book on black loyalists, on black abolitionists, published back in the late 60s, he says 100,000. Okay? And, you know, it's very hard to know the number because some of the records are very scanty. We don't really know. People who are running or escaping from slavery oftentimes don't leave a forwarding address. Okay, it's, you know, we do have pretty legitimate records from New York and from Savannah and Charleston of roughly 12 to 15,000, and then we can make estimates from fugitive slave ads, okay, from diaries. That's how Pybus comes up with this number of 15,000. Okay, I think it's a bit conservative. Whether it's 100,000 like Quarles, if you know the name Benjamin Quarles?
Yeah.
Okay, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. We're still catching up to Quarles' insights. Okay, he's somebody really should be read and reread. Okay, you know, this is a significant number. And then the 5,000 who leave with the English after the War of 1812. Alan Taylor's wonderful book, The Eternal Enemy, which won the Pulitzer Prize a year or so ago, richly illustrates that. Okay? That's what I was referring to. If you think, the argument I was making to you earlier on is that we look at the Underground Railroad as a largely pacifist movement, particularly because of the extraordinary importance of the Society of Friends. And that's true. Okay? But a lot also had to do with armed struggle. And I think that if we begin to add together those self-emancipated people who responded to British and then later Union calls in the Civil War, or did so on their own, okay, the numbers become a lot larger.
That's what I was emphasizing. It wasn't so much the leaving, the returning.
Some did. Some came, you know, there were people who went to Nova Scotia, decided it was inhospitable for them, and went back to New England. Very interesting argument was made that New England and Nova Scotia are sort of a cultural hearth. You know, in some ways, there's not a lot of difference between the cultures of the two areas. Okay? And so there were blacks who certainly went back to New England. Okay? Then there were also those who went back from Sierra Leone to America. And there was correspondence with Peter Williams and with Captain Paul Cuffey, okay, during the period in which blacks believed that Africa was the best destination for them. This is before the founding of the American Colonization Society, which turned them away from that. Okay? I mean, but there's not a lot of them. Okay? When you talk about the black loyalists, you're really talking about a black diaspora, okay, in which they move around the Atlantic and even further. And Pybus has documented black loyalists winding up fighting for the British in Australia, and within a decade or so after that. So you know, it's pretty extraordinary. And certainly we're involved in West India's regiment. Roger Buckley's written about that. And also Pybus has noted what they did in India. So, I mean, to come back to slavery in America, to come back to a place that was inhospitable, even to New York. Remember, New York does not end slavery gradually until 1799, and not finally until 1827. And then what you can see in the 1830s, there's still a lot of this shadow of slavery. People like Riker who think, you know, that a black person should best be a slave and helps out these kidnappers. Okay? That lasts a long time. Okay? You know, I've been talking a lot with my students up at Colgate, and certainly the talk yesterday by Pamela Newkirk, who was present here, the author of the terrific book Spectacle, okay, about New York City's racial past. Okay? I asked Pamela yesterday if there was a time, a golden period in New York City of interracial cooperation. And, you know, it was a little tough. I think you talk about the 60s and 70s as a time when there seemed to be, you know, like rays of hope, okay, when there wasn't some kind of oppression. But certainly throughout the colonial and the antebellum period, racism was the order of the day. Discrimination was everywhere. Blacks had to pay a $250 bond in order to vote. That's a lot of money in those times, about a half a year's salary for the average laborer. So, you know, it's almost prohibitive, okay? Let alone ever be able to hold office. That doesn't happen until the 20th century.
To such an inhospitable environment that just...
Yeah, it was a very hostile environment, and that continues into the 20th century as well. Okay, and her book richly illustrates that spectacle. But, you know, certainly if you read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, when he goes to Midtown, it's clear he's not welcome. Okay, Chester Himes' detective novels, in which he talks about the only people, black people in Midtown were janitors and domestics. Okay, it's really, of course, we know what's happened more recently. New York has got, for all of our cosmopolitanism, for all of our glow as a great world city, race is one of our more troubled aspects. Okay? We've had our noble periods, but not a lot of them. And there have been some times that have been distinctly ignoble. And that, I think, is where, back to your question before about Ruggles and what he was doing, the guys, and I think we also give credit more to someone like Peter Williams Jr. Okay? Those are really courageous people. They're fighting against the slaveocracy at a time when racism was absolutely understood as the common sense philosophical understanding of the day. Okay? And where blacks would be insulted just for walking down the street, where they'd not be allowed to ride on streetcars. Okay? And of course, they could be stolen into slavery. Okay? So it was a rough time. And you have to give them a lot of credit for what they did. They were really courageous people. In fact, here's another argument I think that James Horton, who's a great historian, argued, and I think we see it in Ruggles too, because he writes a lot of letters to the editor exhorting young black men to subscribe to the abolitionist press. He said, don't waste your money on cigarettes or tobacco. We call it tobacco. He said, don't waste your money on alcohol. Okay? Be a man. Subscribe to the abolitionist press. He argued that to fight against slavery was a sign of manliness. That's really a strong statement. You have to put yourself on the line. Right? Because after all, you can be a free black in New York, but you have an incomplete freedom. And Ruggles and others certainly identified with their black brethren who were enslaved in the South, the 2.5 million. Right? They didn't see themselves as racially separate. They didn't see themselves as better than. Okay? They were troubled by that. And they also knew, because of things like the American Colonization Society, because of guys like Dr. Reese, they could come back any time. We see now terrible things happening in the United States. We see presidential candidates making racist utterings and not being corrected in the national press. We see people clapping for them when they say awful things. Martin Luther King would roll in his grave if he heard those things. Okay? History can come back and haunt us. And certainly Ruggles understood that. I used to think that the American Colonization Society, to dwell on that for a moment, was wholly utopian. The idea of sending back a couple of million people to Africa, and of course, many of them had lived in America for generations. And one of the problems, of course, is when they did go back, is they'd lost any immunity to diseases and died very quickly. Okay, this happened with a famous voyage headed by Reverend Daniel Coker of Baltimore. Within 6 months, most people died because they just like whites, they had no immunity to the diseases of West Africa. Okay? I used to think, the whole thing was just hocus pocus. But then I thought about Indian removal. Okay? The forced march, the Tale of Tears, which drove Indian nations out of Georgia and Alabama and pushed them across the Mississippi. Okay? And I thought about the anti-black riots that convinced half of the black population in Cincinnati to leave for Canada as soon as possible. And I realized that the threat was very real. Okay? That people like Ruggles did look at the Colonization Society and not say, this is a bunch of nonsense by guys who don't want to deal with slavery. That was true. But they also were a physical threat as well. Okay? They firmly believed that the black person had no place in America. And they said this constantly in their literature. Too degraded by slavery, they said. Okay? Unable to have the intelligence to be good citizens. Okay? This is commonplace stuff, said by some of the most important theologians and intellectuals of the United States, not just by a slave owner in Alabama, but for example, by Reverend Leonard Bacon. You may not know, but he was very prominent in his day. He was the professor of theology at Yale University and the pastor of the First Congregational Church of New Haven. That's an important theological position. Okay? And he firmly believed that colonization was the best thing that could happen to get rid of free blacks. Okay? So that's the kind of environment in which these guys were living. And I think when they talk about their manliness people fighting slavery, we have to give them credit for an immense amount of courage. Okay? And in Ruggles' case, as with so many, it cost them their lives. I'm kind of talking a long time. Other questions? Okay? Or is it time? It's almost time for the first pitch. So
I have one.
yeah.
There's
Yeah.
someone behind me?
You'd mentioned, just quickly, maybe as an aside, the Seminoles who were marched off in the Trail of Tears.
Yes.
I was wondering if you, this probably isn't central to what you're doing, but since you touched on it, the Underground Railroad that runs south is
Pensacola.
also one that's rarely talked about, but I think is as important and so little known. I wonder if you would shed some light to the degree that you can on that. Thank you.
This is really an extension of the American Revolution. If you look at the wonderful work of Sylvia Fry, Water from the Rock, you'll see that South Carolina is an open civil war, a triangular affair between white loyalists, white patriots, and self-emancipating blacks. Many of whom side with the English or have their own groups, and quite a few of whom head into Seminole Indian territory after an extended civil war which lasts late into the 1780s in South Carolina. Okay? So they eventually go down there. And they do form maroon communities. They intermarry. Okay? They become part of the Seminole Nation. And we could look at the wars headed by future President Andrew Jackson, illicit wars, not authorized by the American government, to go and fight against Seminoles in the 1810s, okay, really as slave-catching expeditions, in which masters would send down detailed lists of people who had left in the 1780s with the demand that their grandchildren be brought back into slavery in South Carolina. Okay? So there's a brand new book out, which I haven't gotten, I ordered it the other day, called Heading for Pensacola. Okay? Harvard University Press has put it out back. The guy's name escapes me right now, but that's the title. You can look at it on Amazon. Okay? And it's exactly about that, about the significant number of self-emancipated people who do go down there, okay? Or who join the Oceanic Underground Railroad. An awkward term if there ever was one. But I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think we have to read, especially up until maybe the early 19th century, the pivot of what we call the Underground Railroad is the Appalachians south into Spanish territory, okay, and west into Native peoples of territory, and then of course the English, the French to the north in Canada. Okay, two examples of that. For much of the 18th century, any black found 40 miles north of Albany would be judged immediately of wanting to join the French. Okay, it's up until the 1760s, and would be executed. Okay, blacks involved in the Stono Revolt of 1739 on their way down to Spanish Florida. It's what I described before about the English is a very commonplace thing to try to undercut your opponent in a war by enticing their enslaved people. You know, it's an understandable tactic. Okay? And so the Spanish did this, the English did this. Okay? And blacks, of course, took advantage of this for their own freedom. So you can see there's a triangular force there.
Following up on that, let me ask you one other question. Because I hadn't factored in the whites from South Carolina into Florida. Are there whites from South Carolina in Florida also going?
Yes.
As well as slaves?
Yeah. Well, sure, they're loyalists.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they're there.
Yeah.
The other group of whites who are there were brought in to settle New Smyrna.
Where?
New Smyrna.
Yeah.
The first sort of English colony.
Right. And also Jamaica.
Right, but I'm just trying to deal with New Smyrna because you've got Italians and you've got Europeans who were brought in specifically
Right.
to populate that area, to establish it as a
Right. After the revolution.
But it fails.
Yeah.
And they move from New Smyrna to St. Augustine.
Which,
So I'm not trying to understand all the populations there. That's
yeah.
what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
You've got South Carolina, white, you've got slaves that are running there. We have Europeans who try to make a go of it,
Mm-hmm.
but who are essentially run out from mosquitoes,
Yeah.
other reasons that they can't stay in, but they're now in St. Augustine.
Right.
And who else is there? I'm just trying to get a handle. Before Spain cedes the territory to the United States.
Well, if you're talking about the late 1780s, I would recommend you look at Maya Jasanoff's terrific book on this, because she details the attempt to establish, if not colonies, sort of these independent states. Because, the white loyalists were also on the losing side. And those that went to Jamaica found that the land they had no value, or was swamp. And that the whites already there didn't welcome them just because they had fought for the crown. And so a number of them go back and try to establish these communities on the mainland in areas where the Americans had very loose control. Okay? It's certainly the case in the 1780s. So I think that probably best you look at that book, because she's got a rich detail about this and about the characters who were involved in that. Okay? She also looks at Canada very successfully too, in a place where I now live, and which has a very rich history. Almost, you almost think about these as maroon communities. Okay? We now begin to appreciate more, and Sylviana Diouf's book on Maroons is very, very useful. A lot more new books coming out about this, about people who sort of separate themselves from what we think about as organized society, okay, certainly from the Patriot government, and occupy areas which they didn't know would eventually become Tallahassee, okay, but they try to control, and not successfully perhaps, but they're really interesting attempts. Okay, so I think Jasanoff's the best source on that territory, but also look at Sylvia Fry's book, Water from the Rock, because it's really highly evocative. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Really, please, I'd like you just to join me to thank Graham again. This was absolutely fascinating. And he's really, I think, increased our knowledge and our vocabulary. Thank you.